and welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Engineer podcast. I am, as always, your host, Sotak Andrei, and you are listening to episode 14, in which I am going to bring you the second part of my conversation with Dr. Scott Stevenson. First of all, if you haven't listened to episode 13, which is the first part of this amazing conversation, pause this and go back to that and listen to that first to hear Scott's background and how he came up with his own fortitude training and a bunch of other cool topics. In this episode, we continue our conversation around muscle hypertrophy and we discuss whether volume or intensity are the more important factor for muscle hypertrophy, whether there should be a role for both, and perhaps you should actually periodize periods of higher versus lower volume training. We also discuss whether you should take all of your sets to failure or whether you should leave a couple of reps in reserve and accumulate more volume that way. We also touch on the individual variation between people and how that might influence your training response and the style of training you actually prefer and choose. And Scott offers some very cool stories about the potential role of mental imagery and how you should approach your training. So there's a lot to take in from this episode as well, just like the previous one, which was actually my most popular episode to date. So fasten your seatbelts and prepare for another amazing episode with Dr. Scott Stevenson. So you've mentioned at the beginning somewhere that what you consider the most important factor for hypertrophy is simply increasing weight in some sort of a manner, at least periodically or on a regular basis. So usually people kind of like to pin against each other volume versus intensity. So the approach we mentioned, where you do fewer sets and you absolutely crush each set and you take it to the absolute failure, or the other approach would be to leave some reps in the tank, or maybe just do the final set to the failure and maybe do something like 3 sets and do RPE 8 and then a 9 and then a 10. So you leave 2 reps in the tank, 1 and then a final failure set. So in the latter version, you could accrue more volume within a workout and within a week. And Mike would argue, and research kind of tends to point that way. So for example, Brett Schoenfeld's recent meta-analysis, I'm sure you've seen it, kind of show that 10 plus sets per week produce more growth than 1 to 5 sets or 6 to 9 sets. They couldn't find an upper limit because there weren't really sufficient studies to establish where the upper limit is. But it certainly didn't seem to slow down at 10 sets. Mike Israetel usually would say that some between 15 and 20 sets would be the sweet point for most people. So with this whole thing in mind, what do you think would be the better approach, or I guess to not put this whole first dichotomy between the two? What I like to do and what Mike likes to do, and I think is the most reasonable, is to periodize it. So let's say you start week 1, you leave a couple reps in the reserve, and then throughout each microcycle, throughout each week, you work harder, maybe even increase sets here and there. And let's say you can take all sets to failure or most sets to failure in the final week of your mesocycle before you do a deload week.
Mm-hmm. So you threw a lot at me there.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay. So one of the things is, and I sort of hinted at the idea, is that, and this is what, sort of the foundational logic of DC training, and I think it still holds, is that if you in some way, as long as you're eating enough to allow for the muscle gains to happen, if you manage to make yourself an impressive lifter, 500-pound squat, a blah, 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 all for reps, then form is going to follow function to a certain degree. You can find powerlifters who don't look like they're that strong, and you can find a lot of bodybuilders who look tremendous, and they're not as strong as you would ever imagine. But to some degree, if you change your strength along the way, that is kind of a sure way to gain muscle mass. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think one of the things I recall from that kind of debate, I guess you could call it, they sort of set up as a debate between Mike and Victor Black, was that Mike was saying that another form of progressive overload would be adding volume, which I think is what you're sort of suggesting here. So
adding in sets.
Yeah, if you could and still recover, and I know he's really big on recovery, if you can set up a scenario whereby, you're doing 8 sets and your total workload is X amount, and you work your way up to doing 15 sets, and you've basically, or let's say 16 sets, and you've doubled your workload, meaning that your performance with those added sets is not going down. Just making this really a simple example. Then you're now capable of doing more, and that would probably mean, if you can do that, if those 8 sets were really, 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 really tough, and those were sort of the best workload performance you could have when you're capable of doing 8 sets, and somehow you work your way up to 16 sets, that when you're doing those 16 sets, that those first 8 sets aren't your maximal capacity. You're laying back to some degree. Does that make sense? So if you wanted to, you could just do 8 sets and have a higher total workload, meaning you use more weight and or reps. So the two ideas of a volume overload and a load overload, or a tensile overload, are tightly interwoven. And the interesting thing from the Schoenfeld meta-analysis, which, yeah, is true, they didn't really find sort of a plateau in terms of muscle gains. They certainly, looked like they maybe had the left side of an inverted U, perhaps. I mean, if you had enough studies where people were doing, 40 or 50 sets per muscle group, you would probably find some negative impact on muscle growth. So at some point, there would be sort of an optimal amount. Superimposed upon that, we can't forget this, is that there is obviously frequency, the other parameters, to what extent does frequency play a role here. So if you do the same load in 1 workout per week versus 2 or 3, we know from some of Brad's other work that 2 or 3 is probably better. 2, maybe 3, not sure. So that's there. And then we have the variability in the extent to which individuals can grow, which is tremendous. And then there's the interactions of those things. Why is it that you have so many of the best bodybuilders in the world who train with high volume, meaning they train relatively infrequently, but that seems to run counter to what the evidence suggests is best for eliciting muscle growth, which is a higher frequency. So why is that? Well, that probably means that for something about them is categorically different in terms of how they respond to the overload, to the stimulus of resistance training. And one of the things that we know from looking at the responders and non-responders is that they have a better growth factor response. IGF-1, MGF, those sorts of things. And these are the growth factors that are important for satellite cell proliferation, which most of the research suggests is really quite important for muscle growth. So I'm getting off tangent here a little bit, but we've got some people for whom the empirical evidence, at least sort of the in the trenches evidence, is pretty clear, grow tremendously well from higher volume, once a week type of training. Then we have the bulk of the research, which if you're, sort of, a lot of times these are just college students, but if we just make the assumption that we've got sort of average genetic potential for muscle growth, seems to suggest that 2 or 3 times a week is best for muscle growth. And that's also kind of the case. There are a couple reviews and meta-analyses with strength also supports that notion that more frequent training is better, at least kind of in the short run. There are going to be different strokes for different folks, so to speak. And this is one of the things I sensed and I knew because I've just seen it, and why I built it into fortitude training is I've got 3 different volume tiers. They're not equally parcel, where volume tier 1 is half of what's in volume tier 2, which is 2/3 of what's in volume tier 3. But the recovery capacity of people varies so much, such that if we try to pin someone down and say that 10 sets or 12 sets or 15 sets is optimal, how those people do those sets is tremendously important, not to mention the frequency of training too. We're not even talking about intensification techniques and all those sorts of things. So what is it that explains why we have so much variability in muscle growth? And you see this in study after study. You see this in terms of the myofibrillar protein synthetic response. You see this in terms of the long-term fiber growth. You see this in terms of the whole muscle cross-sectional area. Is some of that effort? Is it all just genetics? There's a lot of it that's explained by growth factors and in satellite cell proliferation. Actually, the number of the satellite cell density initially is important as well as the growth factor response that would turn on the satellite cell proliferation. But some of it also has to do with the extent to which someone can really push themselves in the gym, and the extent to which they can get a really good feel for training. Like one of the things with Dave Henry, and I can, speak, I've trained with Dave more than anyone because we were training partners for like 8 years, is you can watch how he trains. He's just got a natural ability to focus on the target muscle he's trying to train. You can just see it in how he trains. Even someone like Ronnie Coleman, people used to talk about how sloppy he was, and you could compare him with the other guy who would train at Metroflex, Branch Warren, who everyone said was really sloppy. Looking at those two, and this is just eyeballing it, so this isn't like a scientific thing. You could probably digitize the biomechanics and evaluate inflection points in terms of how the weights move from a concentric to an eccentric phase of a rep. But Ronnie, just from watching him, like even when he was training back, which he always got so much shit for, he looked like he was doing a great job of keeping the back musculature engaged the entire time and using just enough body in English to allow him to lift on the concentric, so he had a lot of loading on the eccentric where the muscle is intrinsically stronger. That's what you see with people who they can fall into a really good, what Dante calls a power groove. You just can tell they're hitting the muscle. And then some people you can just see like overtly from their biomechanics. Like I was watching I saw a guy on a machine I was wanting to get on. He's doing a seated row, and instead of like pulling back with his elbows low to his sides, he was like cocking his arms. He was basically, half of the movement was a biceps curl. And he was a big dude, but you could tell he's using his arms for a large percentage of that lift, much more than he wants. You don't want your biceps really involved at all, ideally, or as minimally as possible. So there's that. So there's all sorts of things that are involved here. And then like, what's the interplay there? Let's say someone they just got a natural, it's easy for them to focus on the target muscle. The training for them is just like, it's not a focus for them to know how to really, really nail a muscle when they're training. And someone else is just a motor moron. They can't get there. Like there are people that, personal trainers might be laughing at this. I've had this happen and seen this where someone's doing a knee extension and they're on like their 10th rep and they can't tell which muscle they're using. It's right there in front of their face. They feel pain, but they don't know where it is. That's their kinesthetic sense. They're that disconnected from their body. So take someone like that. They're going to have a much higher, if you could do an MRI or a functional MRI or a PET scan on their brain, they're going to have much greater activity in their brain and their motor regions for doing these exercises than someone who just is naturally good at it. So what's that do to recovery? How hard does that make the training? And how soon do they stop those sets? Do they go to 8 reps when the RPE is, maybe at 8 reps, the RPE is 9 because they're motor morons, so to speak. And so they stop. Whereas someone else is like, they got a high pain tolerance and they're naturally inclined to train hard. The story I was going to mention before was when we did some muscle soreness testing and some pressure algometry. We pressure on a guy's leg, and I've told this story. Many people have heard it before. There was a guy in this particular study of dozens of college students. We ran through we did a private funded study, did a bunch of muscle soreness testing on them. And this guy was giving like measurements of like 3 out of 100 on this visual analog scale. Like this wasn't painful at all. And a lot of people are doing 50 and 60. And I also knew his strength was destroyed because we were doing strength testing as well. So he got whacked by the muscle soreness protocol, but he didn't think the pain was anything. And afterwards I asked him, you had some interesting measurements. Did you have some painful experiences during your life? And he's like, yeah, I used to be kind of a daredevil, and and I had some heart issues. So they had done open heart surgery on me like 3 times. So cutting through his rib cage. So he'd experienced that as a kid. And he said he tried to jump his BMX bike over a wrought iron fence and he missed and he impaled himself on the top of this fence and was dangling there for hours until someone found him. Like, this is a horror flick, So you're pressing on my leg because my muscle is sore. No, that doesn't hurt very much. I've been impaled and had my body cut open numerous times. So what you're talking about ain't diddly. So those sorts of things are also involved there. That all plays into this tremendous biological inter-individual variability we have. So as far as your question goes, I think, and I kind of go back to that, that's a bunch of evidence pointing in kind of the same direction, I hope, is that it will depend on how the person wants to construct their overall training stimulus in terms of intensity of effort versus volume overload. Some people just aren't wired. They're in terms of pain, in terms of how they lift, what they like to do a DC style training. Some people just don't want to do that. I had a guy who wanted to be my training partner, and we got through the first day of training, and I did my Widowmaker. And when I looked up and was recovered, I said, well, what kind of weight you want to use? He's like, I don't want to do that. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, I'm done. That's it. I'm not doing that. This is our last day of training. I'm like, okay. And he was honest. It was hilarious. It was great. But other people like to get a pump. They can go in there and they can get into a groove. I've had clients who like to throw on some music and they just fall into this groove and they just go and they can do set after set after set, and they can get a volume overload. And they might have the genetics, the growth factor responses, which are persistent, that allow that satellite cell proliferation to persist over many, many, many days. Such an infrequent high volume training is perfect for them. So I think it's sort of nearsighted. It's a mistake that we make so often in many, many ways. You see it all the time. Like, what do the pros take? As if they're all the same. You know, Dave trains with fortitude training. It's one of the best pros there is. A lot of guys train with high volume. Dorian Yates is one of the best bodybuilders of all time. Relatively low volume. Ronnie Coleman, the greatest of all time, high volume and high frequency. He did a 3-way split 6 days a week. People forget that about Ronnie. He was training everything twice a week too, but he recovered from it. So it kind of depends on the person, really. So the short version is it depends.
Yeah, I kind of wish I took notes. I hope I won't forget anything. But yeah, with regards to personality, I have 2 female clients right now that I train, and one of the girls, she's like, you can see her face turn blue, and when I ask her, how was it? She would be like, well, it wasn't too bad. and the other female, I see on her that she can do like 5 reps easily, and she just relaxes the weight. That's it. I couldn't do anymore. But they are relatively untrained, so we still work on improving week after week, so it's no big deal. And I really like that you mentioned personality and what people prefer, because I certainly don't want to dogmatize any approach over another one. And I think we can all agree that consistency is going to be the most important factor, and then improving your training in some sort of a way. So doing more weights, more reps, more sets potentially, even though that's likely not necessary up to a point. Then this whole concept that we're talking is really minutia in the big scheme of things. Maybe it's the last 10% or something like that.
You know, I wrote out an answer. You know, the answer to this question is, what's the most important factor? And what I wrote down was, it's the one that's missing. It's the one that you're not doing, right? And we know this because novelty, like if you just change programs, you're putting something that you weren't doing, and it creates a novel stress. That's why you get so sore the first time you come back from lifting. It's a novel stress. There's multiple stresses, volume and intensity and metabolic stress, and et cetera, et cetera. There's different ways to look at it. Those are all novel. So
all of the sets in resistance training studies are taken to failure usually, just to standardize things, because otherwise you would have confounding variables. And I realized that now a HIT proponent might say, yeah, well, that wasn't true failure. And if they could lower the bar a bit, then it wasn't true failure. But you know what I mean? We're talking about concentric failure. So they can no longer press up the bar during a bench press or something, then that's the failure. And it seemed that even in that circumstance, more sets was yielding better results. So in that sense, it would make sense that more sets would still result in more muscle growth. And the recovery point of view is something that Mike definitely emphasizes, because even the whole MRV concept, if you're familiar with the whole maxi recoverable volume, he coined the concept to convince strength coaches that you can't just tackle on more and more work on their athletes. So they were trying to do their sport-specific work and then tackle on the strength training simply on top of the already pretty much topped out work capacity. So that was his whole thing with the MRV, which is now kind of used to justify reckless amounts of volume. So we are definitely not talking about 40 sets, but we are talking kind of hard sets. So something like 4 reps in reserve tops. So maybe 3 to 4 reps. So still challenging, not to failure, of course, but still challenging sets. And I had this argument question on interaction with guys like Eric Helms and Greg Knuckles and Mike Zordros and the like. And I asked them if they think that we are missing something by not training to failure, so not pushing every set to failure. And they said that even if you leave a rep or two in the reserve, you still get probably similar results, but you don't get that dent in recovery that you mentioned yourself. So I guess the real question is this, whether you should, let's say they can do 16 sets with 2 reps in reserve, they could do 8 sets complete to failure. And I guess the point would be that if you do 16 sets with 2 reps in reserve, that would yield a better result than 8 sets taken to failure, because the overall volume load would be higher in the higher set routine, I guess.
I think it's going to depend on the person to a certain degree, and that is going to be a function of what really pushing to failure is for that individual, what 2 reps in the tank is. I think literally there's an article I wrote for Elite FTS. It's like, I think the title is like something, don't forget what you already know, but I reviewed an article by Ikai and Steinhaus from like 69 on psychological determinants of human strength. And they did some pretty cool stuff in this study. You can't really get away with doing these things anymore. They tested the effects of alcohol. They were looking for disinhibition, central nervous system, various ways that can happen. So they tested alcohol, they tested methamphetamine, they tested shouting, they tested gunshots, and they tested hypnosis, the impact on human strength. And they found that each of those worked. They're having people do an isometric maximal elbow flexion on an isometric, an isokinetic dynamometer. So that was like the basic test. And what they would superimpose, the really interesting ones, and this sort of relates back to what would happen near the end of a set, where you have someone motivating you, or you find some internal source of motivation. Out of nowhere, they're pushing, and all of a sudden, you get a screamer. And their strength would go up. They would get an increment in strength. They had a starter gun. They'd shoot a gun off. It scared the bejesus out of these people. And their strength improved. And they actually did some hypnosis. This is published in the Journal of Applied Physiology. It's a pretty well-known journal. And they actually documented that their hypnosis was working correctly by taking one of their subjects, hypnotizing him. And then they gave him the suggestion that he'd be having a hot poker touched to his hand. And they just used the back of a pen, and he actually had a blister form.
Wow.
That's what it says in the methods. It's Journal of Applied Physiology. It's right there to be read. So how the heck does that happen? What are the mechanisms without the actual tissue damage to cause an inflammatory and blistering response in that skin? There was no hot poker. It was just a thermoneutral piece of plastic, the back of a pen. How do we explain that? What the heck's going on there? So back to the question, 8 sets versus 16, 16 leaving a couple in the tank. Here's my take on that. Is again, I think we're trying to bottleneck an answer, even to some degree. You have to create these simplified examples so you can sort of come up with, sort of bifurcate things to a certain degree. Why not both? Why not periodize? Let's take a step back. Yeah, periodize both. In one case, you do that. This is what, the standard, linear periodization, Matveyev type of linear periodization schema would entail. Where you start off training with a higher volume, kind of taking it easy, develop some metabolic capacity, some work capacity, and then work your way into more intense types of training. Whether those two things would be equivalent if you just started off, I think it would depend on to what extent someone can really turn it on and what 2 reps shy of failure really means to them, as well as all the other things that are involved in recovery. So some people, I think I tried this for years. I messed around with high volume for a long time. 2 reps shy of failure would be probably failure for many people, just for me. The other thing that, you have to consider is the age, the training age of the individual, what they've been through, what their history. So, as you get older, and the more you've trained, the more you know how to train hard. So your 2 reps in the tank is now might have been like 1 rep in the tank, or this is my last rep, 10 or 15 years ago. And I say this with decades of training under my belt, and I still train like an idiot. So, because that's how I like to train. So me with 2 reps in the tank, I just knowing myself, I would, stop with 2 reps in the tank. Probably some of those sets I might only have 1 rep in the tank, or that second rep, if I were to take those to failure, that second rep would have been a nosebleeder. It would have been just like a knockout rep. So it depends on what you mean by 2 reps in the tank. So that's a hard thing. It's a really hard thing to quantify. I mean, heck, even if we look at attempts to quantify percent motor unit activation, where they used a superimposed twitch technique, or they use another sort of motor unit activation technique where they'll have someone do a maximal effort and then superimpose a twitch to the femoral nerves. So you're doing knee extension, all out effort. And then they want to see, assuming you've activated all the motor units that are available, they'll superimpose an electrical signal to the femoral nerve, which would turn on the hamstrings. And if all those motor units are already activated, you will get no increment in force. Well, when we played around with this at a lot of East End when I was in grad school, and some studies show this. You even found studies where in their methods they said they threw out these subjects. Sometimes when you turn on the stim, you get a decrement in force. Well, that's because you can end up having antidromic flow, where you basically you basically negate some of the ascend or the descending motor unit activation. You turn off those motor units because you interfere with what they were doing in terms of activation. So you can have a decrement in force. How can that be? To extent to which people can maximally activate motor units is highly variable. So it's hard to know. Some people, 16 sets would be better. Others, 8 sets might be better.
I think I even said it myself, and I hope I did that. Well, I'm not trying to pin one against the other. And I think he mentioned this during the debate with Victor, that why not, because he has the other concept of max adaptive volume, which is a bit different from MRV. So the volume you need to maximally adapt at a given point. And his argument is that this MAV rises towards the mesocycle. So let's say if you, the first week of your, after the deload, 8 sets was your MAV essentially. Then by the 5th week or 6th week of your accumulation phase, now your MAV might be at 16 sets.
Mm-hmm.
So he likes to titrate volume up via increases in sets and increases in weight if you can. And certainly if you can do that within the mesocycle, you do that between each mesocycle. So week 1 of mesocycle 2 would be a bit heavier than the week 1 of the previous mesocycle. And that's kind of the approach I take. And that's the one that makes most sense to me. Because I think the approach of just, like, if you do a couple of sets, then it's fine, I guess. But if you do decent amount of volume and you take your sets to failure all the time, it just seems unsustainable to me. Like the factors you've mentioned, mental excitement and someone shooting a gun or something, that will certainly increase your performance acutely, but it's not really sustainable, and you can't really ask someone to kidnap your family during each time you train.
No, but you can learn to you can use mental imagery. There's a whole body of literature on mental imagery training where it improves strength in some cases as well as the actual training does. People just imagine the training. So there's a powerful training technique in that. And I tell you what, I mean, I won't get into it because it probably I might even break down here if I talk about it too much. But there have been a few times in the last few months when I was crying in the gym. I was crying because of the emotions that I brought forth. And you can train yourself to do that. Like that's what actors do. You know, when you see those actors where you're like, oh my God, look how they're emoting. Those are real. So you can do that. And not everyone can do that, but it's possible. I know it because I do it.
I've seen George Lehman when I've seen some videos of him deadlifting, and he said that I think his brother died, and he says to himself that if he pulls that weight, his brother is going to be brought back to life. And he's in tears essentially when he deadlifts.
Yeah, I have some similar types of, we have a dark self, that we don't generally talk about a lot of times. There's a dark side to many of us, don't want to get into like Jungian philosophy or anything like that, but like there's an aspect of that to a lot of us. And we like to watch violence. We like to watch like lots of dark movies. These things are popular for a reason. It appeals to us. We don't talk about it, but all those things can be used to drive your training if you want.
Yeah.
So that's a perfect example. Like the speech that Kai Green gave. I mean, you can you can do something like just think about like if you want to someone that pissed you off during the day, and you didn't do anything about it, but you still have some bottled up frustration, let it loose. Think about I'll get gruesome here. Like some people have been abused, in various ways in their past. Think about rising above those situations. You don't want to perpetuate that pain. That might not be the best thing for getting past whatever hangups those might have produced in your life. But we all have life struggles and it's all relative. Some people, lived in concentration camps, and some people didn't get the attention they wanted from their parents. But all of them can be for the individual very, very meaningful. You can draw upon that if you want. If that's your bent, you can do it. So you can turn yourself into an absolute maniac in the gym, some better than others, But those are the people that a lot of times will make progress if they can call upon that, because it's within our capabilities. So I think you can shoot off a gun, psychologically speaking.
Yeah, I see what you mean. I'm not sure what that does to recovery though. So the same workout on paper, how much recovery demands would that have if you applied that sort of a attitude, I guess, to it? You might need extra 2 days of recovery, and
Yeah,
you could simply not do that and leave a bit in the tank and come back 2 days later and repeat the same workout or something like that and accumulate more volume, more reps, more quality volume, I guess.
yeah, and that's where you'd have to drop your volume down if you train that way. If you partake of that and that's what you like to do, then you'll have to adjust. Yeah.
I guess it all depends on personality, and I kind of wanted to say this previously and I forgot that, well, let's say you end up squatting 500 or something. That will take you decades. So all of these things that we're talking about kind of are in the more relatively short term, I guess. So during the decades, it kind of all washes out. And I think the big thing is really what keeps you in the gym, actually. What keeps you progressing and what keeps you injury free.
Yeah, just thinking the same thing.
This would be one of the main arguments for periodizing relative and absolute efforts. So periodizing how close you get to failure and how heavy your weights are. Because novelty is definitely a thing, and after a deload you are kind of a bit detrained, even though it was only a week, but you are still partially detrained, so you can get away with training a bit lighter weights than your last week of the accumulation phase. And so easy gains essentially what would be called, and that doesn't increase your risk of injury. If you are, let's say, at 3 reps in reserve, that's a much lower risk of injury than being at failure or even beyond failure.
I've got 2 thoughts there. One, just sort of a philosophical one, and one on constructing the deload. This is a fun conversation, by the way. This is good. I'm glad you brought me on. People ask me all the time, like, how do you look like that, or how long you've been lifting, what have you. And sometimes the conversation comes around to, I started a lift or bought a membership or what have you. And really, to a large extent, we're creatures of immediate gratification. You got to find some bigger reason, hope ideally, but also some immediate value in your training. It should be fun. There should be something about it that you really enjoy, I think. If it's just torture from start to finish, maybe you need to torture yourself. I mean, maybe you're like that character, the Punisher, who's just like he's built to just punish himself as much as everyone else. But there should be something that you're getting out of your training, I think. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. You won't keep doing it. So maybe you got to geek out with, looking at your loading, and you come home and you plug everything in your computer, and, you really love sort of tracking minutia. And that in of itself is really rewarding to you. Then do it. Like, if it keeps you doing it, then that's great. And it's enjoyable in and of itself, because the body, especially in the case of bodybuilding, that can be taken from you in any moment. That can be taken in a split second. Get in a car wreck and you've got a spinal cord injury. I spent a few years working with people with spinal cord injuries, and it was kind of a shock to me, because I'd been lifting for quite a while at that time, and I was, I really had to grapple with what that would be like. What would I do? How would I respond to that? I know how I would now, but it gives you some perspective. So the training should be, something about intrinsically valuable to you in some way, because the body could be taken at any time. I think that's my thought, at least. I think that tends to, it fits with some things that I picked up from a guy named Rod Dishman, who was kind of the foremost expert on exercise adherence for years. He spent decades of his academic career researching it, and then he sort of abandoned that line of research and started doing sort of psychobiology stuff with rats and those sorts of things, more so because he just sort of figured out that people are just creatures of immediate gratification. You can come up with, means of social support and peer support and apply various models of health behavior and that sort of thing and get, some improvement in exercise adherence. But we want, immediate neurochemical rewards. We want dopamine and some serotonin now and again, and we want to feel good. That's what we want. So if training, you got to make it feel good in some way, shape, or form. Otherwise, it'll extinguish. The behavior won't continue. So that he took him 20 years to figure that out. So
yeah, that's why I try as much as I can to not force either of my clients or people I happen to train or whatever, or even myself, to not force anyone into a training system or an exercise or a setup or whatever that they don't enjoy, because ultimately if they are going to stick to it, it has to be effective and efficient, but it also has to be fun. And yes, for us, that pain and that weight crushing us and whatever, that's fun actually. And even the hunger during a diet or whatever, that's fun, even though it might be acutely considered painful and whatever, but it's still, in the long game, it's still worthwhile. So
this would get us way off topic, but I think to some degree we as humans are kind of wired for that. We're wired to be dissatisfied. And I say that because it's dissatisfaction with life's current state of affairs that led humans to seek out new ways to survive, to seek out new territory. Maybe it created intermingling where, members of one tribe of a hunter-gatherer would make their way over to another tribe and you spread DNA around. But something about us, and this is obvious in how we are, is basically intrinsically dissatisfied. That's sort of how we are, and this is sort of that's the nature of our suffering if you look at it from a Buddhist perspective. But we're just inherently dissatisfied with the current moment to some degree. So it's what's put us on made us this sort of virus that spread across Earth in the way that it is, where we just can figure out a way to take over any environment and do what we've done to the rest of the species and the environment of the Earth. But it also makes us, I think, sort of wires us to want to sort of seek out things that are difficult and that create struggle, because those are the, if we feel okay with that, there's survival value in that. I think natural selection has probably brought that out in us to some degree. So being someone who just loves the stress and the pain of exercise, someone who could somehow see the adventure in making an Arctic trek, or having to brave the struggle of, traversing a mountain range because, wherever you happen to be is, the river is run dry or whatever. That sort of finding and feeling and sensing some sort of intrinsic value in a struggle like that, it's built into our psyches. The people who are just oh, whatever, we'll just sit here and wait till the river starts to flow again. Well, those are the ones who sat there and died of dehydration.
Yeah.
Those are the ones who didn't make it. It's the ones who are we got to go. We got to kick ass. We got to take names. We got to find something new. We need to be innovators. Those are the humans that are around. Those are the ones who made it. I think we don't have ways to express that a lot of times in exercise and, sports in general. Bodybuilding for sure, I think, is a way to express that part of our nature.
Yeah, I was listening a while back and I actually took some notes on this. I was listening to the podcast episode of Joe Rogan with Jocko Willink.
Oh yeah, he's awesome.
And they discussed this whole concept and the value of doing something physically challenging and the primal need for it, I guess, and how people who don't do that are kind of lacking something, and you can kind of see it in them because then they turn into other avenues that are potentially destructing and to themselves and to the other people around them. So I noticed this myself too, that I just miss it, honestly, and I feel so much better. And
the book I've been listening to is one by Robert Sapolsky. He's been on the Joe Rogan show too, I think.
Yep, I listened to the one he did with Joe and the one he did with Sam Harris.
We listen to all the same podcasts here, it sounds like. There's some good stuff. Yeah, I love Sam's podcast. But in Sapolsky's book, Behave, it's a pretty long segment in there. I'm doing the audiobook, but he talks about variations in dopamine receptor and how that relates to individualistic communities and cultures like the United States, where the sort of a priority on the individual and standing out, versus collectivist cultures. And one of the things they've been able to do is sort of trace the different dopamine receptor isoforms, which have relatively different affinities for dopamine, which is involved with our dopaminergic reward system. And you can track the percentage of the dopamine receptor isoform that has low affinity. So these people are sort of lacking in the dopaminergic reward signal. So they need more adventure, they need more stimulus out of life than people who have the different isoforms. And that tracks with migration patterns of humans around the world, all the way down to the Amazon basin and across the Bering Strait, from the cradle of life and kind of around the world. There's this, the people who were the greatest explorers, the ones who just hopped on a boat and just went for it, or said, we're going to just cross that strip of land. We have no idea what's over there. We're just going to do it. Those are the ones who, at least in terms of this dopamine stuff, this is just one aspect of their neurophysiology, or the ones who are sort of adventure and pleasure seekers, because in order to get that dopaminergic kick, they had to do something crazy. They had to jump out of airplanes, if they had them, or they had to climb mountains or go on these, crazy adventures. And the people who were like, well, we can just hang out here. We're cool with how this is. They were different. And I think it would be interesting to see if someone looked at like extreme sports versus chess players or something like that versus just a control population, what the range is, like just for instance, that dopamine receptor. And I suspect that maybe you and me and Jocko and Joe and a bunch of other people that we know who like to just like go in the gym and just alter their consciousness to an extraordinary extent might have those dopamine receptors that need a little bit extra dopamine in order to get a strong signal to the neurons.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. I wouldn't consider myself on that extreme because I certainly don't feel the need to do unnecessarily dangerous things. But I still like to challenge myself both physically and mentally. So
intermediate, maybe. There's 7 isoforms, I think, so you might be in the middle somewhere.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the middle with everything. Genetics-wise, for training, for muscle growth, for strength, definitely, because I'm not terrible and I'm not, obviously not amazing either. So it would make sense that I'm in the middle with regards to that too. So I think it would be great to wrap this up for now and continue at another time, because we have gone for, 2 hours and a half, something like that, and
yeah,
we haven't even gotten to a third of the topics I wanted to touch on.
Yeah, I thought this might happen. You're too. You know what it is? You're too interesting. It's. I'm going to blame it on you. It's because you have such good responses, and to my responses that we go off topic. It's just too much fun talking. So
thank you.
You're welcome.
It's a topic that I am super interested in, and I could talk about it.
I can tell.
Well, with interesting people, I could talk about it for weeks, I guess. So in case anyone wants to connect with you on social media or find your training program or go to your podcast, what would be the best places to find you and find all that?
FortitudeTraining.net is the easiest. Advices Radio, I think it's .com. If you just type in Advices Radio, you'll find that. That's where the podcast is hosted. But there's a link somewhere on my website too.
Awesome, and can link your Facebook account, and I know you're on Instagram. I don't know how much you use that, but
my Instagram's actually fun. It's mostly when I come up with some novel exercise variations, because I think that's an important part of muscle growth. We haven't really got into exercise selection so much, but it's fun. I come up with some kind of I've even spoof of myself sometimes because I come up with some weird stuff, but what I think are effective exercises. And I always get asked the question, it's funny, after what we talked about, how do you do all these weird exercises? Why don't you just do like real basic regular training? I'm like, oh, I do. But everyone does that. I'm trying to add something new and different here.
Yeah. My main issue is when an exercise hurts people or doesn't fit them structurally and anatomically at all, and they kind of force themselves and they just go through joint pain and pick up injury after injury and still go back to the same old shit that injured them in the first place. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, well, that's part of, being the tribal animals that we are, is that if everyone's saying you should do this, then we fall in line. Thinking for oneself is not something that a lot of people are inclined to do necessarily, because, there's safety in doing what most people suggest to do. And it's not a bad idea to say, back squats are going to be good for your legs, but there's also some common sense that you think would come into play there, but not for everyone.
Yeah, it's like the saying, common sense isn't so common. So
yeah, ironically, it's funny that we say common sense, because the common sense sometimes goes against what the common notions are. So it's not really common sense to pay attention to the obvious signs that the exercise isn't working for you.
Yeah, you would think that people would stop if something causes them pain, but pain in the bad way, at least.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, Scott, I want to thank you for this fantastic conversation, and I really look forward to the second part of this. And I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, me too. This was great, bud. I really liked it. At this rate, we've got about 5 more hours of podcasting to do before we get through just the questions you threw out. So
Yeah, I didn't anticipate all the rabbit holes, I guess, that would come up. So
yeah, this might give people a chance to ask some questions. I think you put it out there for some questions from other folks. So if you want to bring some of those into the next time we talk, that's cool too.
yeah, awesome. So I will let you go train, and I hope you have a great productive workout, and we'll talk soon.
All right, my man. Enjoy your day.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So that was episode 14 of the Muscle Engineer podcast with Dr. Scott Stevenson. I hope you enjoyed the episode and found it valuable and helpful, and hopefully took some nuggets that you can incorporate into your own training. Now, as always, it's time for me to give what I thought were the top 3 most important key take-home messages from this episode. The first important message here is to put everything we've discussed with Scott during these 2 episodes into perspective and see the bigger picture. Like I've mentioned, like Scott has mentioned, if you want to be successful with your physique goals, this is going to be a journey that's going to take you decades. Like Scott has been lifting for almost 4 decades, so he definitely knows what he's saying. So always, whenever we discuss these advanced programming methods and whatnot, keep that in mind, that that's with the assumption that people are actually going to stick to the training and are actually going to lift year after year. So regardless if you prefer a higher volume or lower volume training or anything in between, or you prefer to take your sets to failure or not to failure, make sure that you are actually progressing over time. I think I mentioned this in the previous episode too, but it's something worth reiterating over and over again, because I see it so often in gyms with people not doing it. So make sure that what you're lifting right now for 8 reps, 10 reps, 15 reps, whatever, it's actually heavier than what you were lifting 6 months or a year ago. And if you do that for decades, you're definitely going to get bigger too. Another big part is avoiding injuries. So that's where I think intelligent exercise selection and programming comes into place. It's not really that one gives you more optimal results in 8 weeks or 12 weeks, whatever. That's like, yeah, that's relevant, but in the big scheme of things, it's not really. The big thing is actually avoiding injuries and being able to lift year after year safely and being able to make progress that way. Point number 2 is around the inter-individual differences that Scott has mentioned too, and the effect of personality on the type of training people prefer and actually can stick to. So is doing a couple of sets per exercise and bringing them to absolute failure optimal? Maybe not. Is very advanced progression method where you try to find that optimal maximum adaptive volume for each week the best way to grow? Perhaps. But it doesn't matter if someone doesn't like it and they won't do it. So unless you're working with some robots or some Olympic athletes, in which case you're probably not listening to this episode, real people have actual real feelings and preferences and lives and families and whatnot. So if someone only has 60 minutes to lift or whatever, 45 minutes, it doesn't matter that you think that doing 15 sets per workout is optimal if they only have time for 6. If someone only has time for 6 sets per session, yeah, they better take those sets to failure, because that's going to give them the best return on investment. So just because you think that something is optimal for you or for someone in a particular scenario, that doesn't mean that someone else's training isn't optimal for them in their particular situation, in their life circumstances. And the final point number 3 is around the value of doing something challenging, both physically and mentally, on a regular basis, ideally every day. So like I said, I found the discussion between Jocko and Joe Rogan absolutely fascinating, and it reminded me of what Jordan Peterson said to Joe Rogan too. And I find it absolutely amazing that 2 people with completely different backgrounds can come to very similar conclusions. But before I digress, there is definitely something valuable and primal or evolutionarily useful or whatever you want to call it in doing a task or a thing that seems almost impossible and something that humbles you initially, but then you get better as you start doing it more and more, and eventually you overcome it, and then you put new obstacles in your way and you overcome that too, and so on and so forth. So regardless if you prefer lifting, if you prefer mountain climbing, if you prefer Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if you prefer another combat sport, whatever you prefer, it doesn't really matter that much. The important thing is to actually do something, and the benefits go way beyond just the obvious physique improvements or health improvements. They really translate to all aspects of life, and you can see this with a lot of the top bodybuilders who are not only successful in their particular sport, but they also have successful businesses and are successful people in pretty much most aspects of their lives. So there's definitely something there. So I think I've gone long enough, so I'll just wrap it up here. Thanks again for listening. I hope you liked the episode, and I've made some upgrades to my microphone setup, so I hope that the audio quality was much better on this one than the last one, and I'll do my best to continue upgrading both my equipment and my interviewing abilities as I do these more and more, and hopefully I will be able to give you guys continuously better quality episodes, both from a audio point of view and both from a content point of view. So thanks again, and I'll see you all next week.